Neville Goddard framed the idea implied by the title, "I Manifested Money by Trusting This Moment," as a statement about psychological position rather than about external technique. In his model, to trust the present does not mean to feel hopeful or optimistic about what may occur. It means to occupy a state in which the present is already accepted as complete. Trust, as he used the term, is not an emotion directed toward the future, but an inner settlement in which the mind no longer relates to itself as lacking. The core claim is that experience organizes itself around what consciousness accepts as already true. When the present is trusted as sufficient, the mind is no longer oriented toward acquisition, but toward possession. The organizing factor is not effort, desire, or intention, but the inner position of having. The question implicit in this claim is whether the mind can actually rest in such present acceptance without returning to the habitual structure of waiting. For this model to function, a foundational assumption must be in place. Neville assumed that consciousness is the primary field in which value, meaning, and reality are first established. Circumstances are not treated as the source of certainty. They are treated as expressions that acquire their significance through awareness. Trust can only be causative if the sense of having is first decided inwardly rather than inferred from external evidence. You are asked, within this framework, to consider the possibility that security is not derived from conditions, but is a condition of mind that precedes how conditions are interpreted. The ordering is clear. Awareness evaluates, and experience reflects that evaluation. The unresolved tension is whether one can maintain this ordering without continually reverting to the assumption that value must be confirmed from outside. The psychological mechanism Neville describes centers on identification. Trust, in his usage, is not reassurance and not positive emotion. It is the feeling of being located in a state where lack is no longer the reference point. A thought can occur without being believed. A possibility can be considered without being inhabited. Trust marks the moment when a condition is no longer treated as future or hypothetical, but as present and self-defining. You are invited to notice how the mind distinguishes between what it merely entertains and what it accepts as its current situation. In Neville's language, feeling is the sense of reality attached to an assumption. When a state is felt as real, the mind relates to it as this is the case now, and behavior, expectation, and interpretation align accordingly. Imagination plays a precise role in establishing this sense of present reality. Neville did not define imagination as fantasy or wishful thinking. He treated it as the mind's capacity to experience a condition as if it were now in effect. Imagination allows the present to be structured by a chosen assumption rather than by past patterns. Feeling then functions as the confirmation that the imagined state is being accepted as actual rather than speculative. You can observe that some imagined situations remain clearly labeled as unreal, while others carry a sense of immediacy and fact. In this model, the latter are the ones that shape identity. The tension here is whether the mind can sustain imagination as present identification without sliding back into future-oriented anticipation. From this follows the role of attention and repetition. Neville placed strong emphasis on the discipline of inner focus, not as suppression but as stabilization. Inner speech, habitual thought patterns, and recurrent assumptions continually reinforce a particular sense of self and situation. To trust the present, in his framework, is to allow attention to rest in statements and impressions that imply sufficiency rather than lack. Repetition is not mechanical. It is the process by which a state becomes familiar and therefore believable. You are asked to notice how the mind, through constant rehearsal, comes to treat certain conditions as normal and others as improbable. Discipline, here, means allowing only those inner references that are consistent with the accepted state of having. The open question is whether such consistency can be maintained without becoming rigid or effortful. The internal logic of causation in Neville's system follows a clear sequence. If trust defines the state, and the state defines perception, interpretation, and action, then experience will appear organized around that state. The model does not claim that events are forced into being by thought. It claims that the pattern of experience is structured by prior identification. What the mind takes as already settled becomes the reference point from which decisions are made. Opportunities are recognized and meanings are assigned. You can observe in ordinary life that a sense of security or insecurity changes how the same information is processed. Neville extended this observation into a general principle. Inner sufficiency precedes and organizes outer accumulation. Whether this precedence can be directly observed or only inferred from patterns over time remains an open question within the framework itself. This way of understanding inner certainty has appeared repeatedly in intellectual history. Philosophical traditions that treated conviction as a present condition rather than as a future reward, and psychological models that emphasize the formative role of expectation and self-concept, all reflect a similar structure. What distinguishes Neville's presentation is the explicit focus on feeling as the marker of reality. He did not appeal to doctrine or ritual, but to the cognitive fact that what is accepted as real organizes perception and behavior. The continuity suggests that the idea of present certainty as formative is not unique, but part of a long-standing attempt to explain how inner orientation shapes experienced conditions. Perception within this model is therefore not a neutral recording of facts. It is filtered through the assumed state. When the present is trusted as sufficient, situations are interpreted through a framework of having rather than lacking. The same event can be seen as confirmation or as threat depending on the underlying assumption. You are invited to notice how interpretation follows identity. Neville's claim is not that the world changes because one believes, but that the experienced world is structured by the standpoint from which it is viewed. The open issue is how to distinguish genuine restructuring of perception from reinterpretation. That occurs after outcomes become known. Agency, in Neville's system, is defined as alignment with the state rather than as direct control over circumstances. Responsibility lies in what one consents to as real within consciousness. Action is not eliminated. It is seen as the natural expression of the state one occupies. When the mind is identified with sufficiency, choices and responses arise from that identification without the need for compulsive striving. You are asked to consider agency as the capacity to remain in a present position of having rather than as the capacity to manipulate future results. The tension remains whether such alignment can be sustained without reverting to effort-based orientation. The phrase manifested money by trusting this moment, when interpreted within Neville's framework, does not describe a technique, but an internal ordering. Trusting names the state of present possession. Manifested names the experienced correspondence that appears when perception and circumstance are organized around that state. The language can suggest transaction, but the model itself describes identification and organization rather than mechanical production. The unresolved question is whether this correspondence can be understood purely as cognitive sequencing without introducing assumptions about external force. Cognitive stillness, in Neville's thought, is the condition in which the mind is no longer oscillating between having and waiting. When a state is fully accepted as present, inner dialogue seeking confirmation subsides. The system then appears as a closed structure, consciousness as the primary field, trust as the marker of identification, present assumption as the organizing center, and experience as the structured expression of that center. To understand this, Framework is not to be required to affirm it or reject it, but to see how its elements interlock. The remaining tension is whether understanding itself can remain at rest, without turning into another form of anticipation or another attempt to secure future outcomes.